I'm Preeti. I'm currently in Hawaii. And just to go back a little, I did my PhD from Bengaluru, on interstellar medium. And then I worked at Ayuka for a few months with their teaching learning center. And now I'm working as a postdoc at Subaru Telescope on this particular project, Project Panoptes. So now Panoptes is an acronym for Panoptic Astronomical Networked Observatories for a Public Transiting Exoplanets Survey. I know there's a lot of keywords in there, but don't worry about it right now. We'll get back to it later. This is just to let you know what Panoptis stands for. Now, in a very small nutshell, Project Panoptis can be defined as a citizen science project that aims to make it easy for anyone to build a low-cost robotic telescope that can be used to detect transiting exoplanets. You saw the robot behind moving, the same one. But in order to learn what the project is about or how it works, it is important that we first understand the following two keywords in the definition of Project Panoptis, which is citizen science and exoplanets. So let's start with citizen science. Now, when we speak of science, we have this tendency to immediately associate it with professional scientists. However, science as a field is not limited to or only practiced by the professionals with appropriate degrees. A lot of scientific research is also carried out by amateur scientists. I'm sure most of you by now have come across amateur astronomers or amateur astronomy groups in your city. If not, please look for an amateur astronomy group close to you. I guarantee you will have some amazing experiences with their astronomy activities. Coming back to citizen science. So citizen science is a practice of the public participating and collaborating in scientific research to increase scientific knowledge. Simply put, it is a collaboration between the people who are curious about a field and willing to take part, and the scientists who are working on that field. Now, citizen science projects can vary widely with respect to the field. It also depends on the number of participants that are required for that particular project. The age group of the participants in the projects can vary a lot. Any prerequisite knowledge, so certain projects may require you to know about the project in advance. Some projects don't require you to know any information about that field in advance. The extent to which participants may be involved in the research itself. You might be in step one where you're collecting data. You might be in a project that involves you in step one and step two where you're collecting data and analyzing data, and probably part of the publishing itself. So all this varies depending on the project. And it also depends on whether the participation is on site, where you're in person at a particular place to carry out the work, or whether it's all done online. So to give a few examples, now one of the most well-known citizen science projects in India is Bird Count India and eBird. This is suitable for people who like to bird watch or do bird photography. Here, the interested participants create an online account and document their bird sightings with location, date, and time information. This is an on-site example of citizen science project, where the participant also needs to be familiar with different species of birds in order to document the sightings correctly. This information is then used by scientists to study the bird population distribution, their area of spread, and understand their habitats. So two key things to take in this particular example is that this is an on-site project where you need to be at a certain location and then catalog that information. And you need to have some sort of prior information about birds and some knowledge about them so you're identifying them correctly. Here is another example. This is something that I took part in. This is called the humpback whale counting, and it happens in Hawaii every year when the humpback whales migrate close to the island. Now, this was also an on-site participation. I needed to be there at a certain location to take part in this project. But it did not require me to have any prior knowledge about marine biology or humpback whales. So the only thing I needed to know to take part in this citizen science project was to see the whales and count them. I just needed to know how to count numbers. That was my contribution. Now, another citizen science project I volunteered a few years back was in archaeology. Here, the archaeologists needed help with putting together thousands of stone fragments to reconstruct a 1,200-year-old Scottish monument. This was done completely online, and I didn't need to have any knowledge of archaeology in order to do this. This was as good as just playing a jigsaw puzzle online. So kids could do this too. You didn't have to be on site and you didn't have to have any prior knowledge. This is just a game that I played where I would put the pieces together and click on save, and the archaeologist on the other side would try to fit those pieces and say yes or no, whether it worked or not. So citizen science projects are plenty, and it very often just comes down to picking the right one that works for you. Now, in terms of your area of interest, it can be in terms of how much time you're ready to spend on it, if you prefer only online or on-site activities, your prior knowledge of the subject, etc. If there is a subject that you're interested in, just go online and search for citizen science along with the subject name, and you might be able to help the scientists in the subject. On that note, if you're interested in citizen science projects in astronomy, please do check out NASA's Citizen Science Projects website. They fund several citizen science projects in several fields, not just astronomy. And Project Panoptis is also in part funded by NASA. Let's move to the next topic at hand, the next keyword, exoplanets. So starting with exoplanets. So let's start with the basic. What is an exoplanet? Now, exoplanets are just planets which are outside our solar system, which are not part of the 8 planets that we know of, not orbiting our sun. Any planet which is outside of this system is referred to as an exoplanet, exo meaning outside, or it's also known as an extrasolar planet. Now, just like how the polar planets in our solar system are very different from one another, the exoplanets also differ greatly from one another. So they can be classified into different types based on parameters that I have listed here. That is the size of the planet or its radius, the mass of the planet. So like Jupiter is more massive than Earth. The orbit of the planet around its star, how far or close to the star the planet is. So Saturn and Jupiter are farther away than Mercury and Venus. Whether the planet orbits a single star, like our planets orbit just the sun, or if they orbit a system of stars. So these are binary stars and you have a planet going around them. The composition of the planet itself, is it a rocky planet like Earth, or is it a gas giant like Jupiter? Can it have carbon or water, etc.? So let's have a quick look at some of the types of exoplanets. So in the plot axis shown here, the vertical y-axis says planet radius RE. This refers to the size of the planet relative to our Earth's radius. So RE is radius of Earth. So one RE means same radius as Earth. Above this one RE line are the planets which will be bigger than Earth, and below this line are the planets that are smaller than Earth. So just make a note of where the 1 is on that axis. The horizontal y-axis is labeled as stellar flux Earth units. This refers to how much sunlight we receive on Earth, which is 1 stellar flux on this line. So Earth would fall in the 1 on the vertical and the 1 on the horizontal, in that region. To the left of this point of 1 on the x-axis, the value decreases and denotes exoplanets which are hotter than Earth. To the right of this point are cooler exoplanets. So we'll see the plot of the different types of exoplanets now. So one of the first things you might notice on this plot is that the exoplanets are also classified based on our own understanding of our own solar system planets. So exoplanets are called Earth-like or super-Earths or Jovians or cold Neptunes and so on. Jovians refers to giant planets like Jupiter's. So when we have this classification of exoplanets, very often it is in relative terms to what we know about our own solar system. Another thing you will notice on this plot are vertical lines between the planets. And these lines have labels ZnS, which is zinc sulfide, H2O, which is water, CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and CH4, which is methane. These lines indicate the condensation lines, where the labeled molecules will condense to form clouds in the planet atmosphere. This basically means that to the left of each of these lines, the temperature would be too high for those molecules to condense. So at that particular line, those molecules can start condensing because the temperature is right for them. So for example, let's take the cold Jovian that you see right on top, the big orange one to the right top corner. If you take the cold Jovian closer to its star, you are basically moving it to the left of this plot. And then it becomes a warm Jovian, which is capable of holding condensed water. Now coming to another part about exoplanets, the question of can we live on them? One of the biggest questions driving exoplanet studies is there life on other planets? Now, in the search for life, we look to see if an exoplanet falls in the habitable zone. The habitable zone, in the simplest sense, is the area around a star where it is not too hot and not too cold for liquid water to exist on the surface of the planet. So the habitable zone in this diagram is denoted in green. The red zone is where it is too hot for water to exist in liquid form, and blue zone is where it's too cold and the water freezes. So the habitable zone is defined based on our current understanding of how life started and thrives on Earth. So this is what we think is the necessary criteria for life to exist based on what we have seen on Earth. Now, this is only the first step in finding the habitability of an exoplanet. It is then followed up with more detailed studies to look for chemical signatures of elements and compounds that can support the formation of life. So you might have recently heard a news claiming scientists found life on planet Venus. What scientists found was one of those chemicals in Venus's atmosphere called phosphine. Now, phosphine can be produced by different processes such as lightning, meteor impacts, volcanic activity, and by organic life forms. In the case of Venus, the amount of phosphine that was found could not be explained by any other process involving lightning or the meteor impact or the volcanic activity, leaving the only possible option as possibly organic life forms. However, it is important to note that life itself has not been detected on Venus. So finding the habitable zone is only the first criteria, and then you have to look for multiple biosignatures of what can support life and create life on that planet. And then look for alternate possibilities of why those molecules might exist apart from life as well. Is life the only option for those particular molecules to exist? So how many exoplanets are there though? Now, as of today, there are 4,284 confirmed exoplanets. Now, these are planets that have been confirmed by more than one method. And you can see the breakup of the different types of planets that have been found within these 4,284. So a lot of Neptune-like planets, a lot of gas giants, super Earths, a few terrestrial, and 6 of them unknown. There are 5,514 candidates, NASA candidates. These are likely planets, but they're yet to be confirmed by the multiple detection system. And there are also 3,197 planetary systems. These are the number of stars around which these 4,284 planets have been confirmed. And if you wish to see a catalog of all these confirmed exoplanets, you can check out the NASA's website. They have a complete catalog listed over there. So how do you find these exoplanets though? I mean, it took so long for us to find the planets within our own solar system, which were very far away, like Neptune. So how do you find these exoplanets which exist in some other system very, very far away? So one of the first methods I'm going to talk about is called radial velocity and Doppler shift. You might have heard of Doppler shift before, likely in the context of sound waves, of how the pitch of an ambulance's alarm changes as it approaches you and moves away. So something similar happens to light when a star moves towards us or farther away from us. When the star moves towards us, its wavelength shifts to a lower wavelength, and it's called blue shifted. So the spectrum becomes slightly more bluish. And when the star moves away from us, its wavelength shifts to a higher wavelength, and it's said to be red shifted. Now, how does this help in finding an exoplanet though? Why would a star be moving around like that? So what happens is when you have a planet which is going around a star, The planet also exerts a little bit of gravitational pull on the star. This causes the star to slightly wobble. This wobble in turn causes the star to either slightly move towards us or away from us as the planet continues to orbit. And this causes the shift in the wavelength that can be measured. So we can find a little bit of the blue shift and a little bit of the red shift as and when the star slightly wobbles. So that is one way to detect that there is something around the star or close to the star which is causing the star to wobble. So the second method that is used to find exoplanets is called the transit method. Now, during a planet's orbit around the star, if and when the planet passes in front of the star's light that's reaching us slightly reduces. This will depend on the size of the planet and the distance of the planet from the star, how much it reduces, how long it reduces, etc. This is known as a transit event, and is same as the transits of Mercury and Venus that you might have heard of in the last few years, which you see across the surface of the sun. This is the same as eclipses when the moon passes in front of the sun and blocks the sun. So on a much smaller scale though, where you have a planet which is very far away, blocking its star's light just a little bit. And by measuring this dip in the light, we can find out the properties of the exoplanet as well. We can find out how big it is or how far away it is from its star, etc. So this is another method that's used to detect exoplanets. So method 3 is directly imaging an exoplanet. Now, exoplanets are very far away and millions of times dimmer than the stars that they orbit. Taking a direct image of an exoplanet is very challenging. So one way is to block the light from the star, so the exoplanet can be seen without the starlight saturating the camera. This is done by using a device called a coronagraph inside the telescope, which blocks only the light from the star before it reaches the telescope camera. This method is also used to study our sun's atmosphere without the sun saturating the image. So if you see in this image, that circle you see in the center, that is a coronagraph that is blocking the sun. So you can see the sun's layers and the atmospheres outside of it. So method 4 is called gravitational microlensing. So in gravitational microlensing, this happens when a star or a planet's gravity manages to focus a little bit of the light of a very distant star. So this is the same as any other gravitational microlensing you might have heard of, where you can see a star through gravitational microlensing. So this causes the distant star to temporarily appear to be a tad bit brighter. So if the object which is causing this microlensing, in this image you see there is a star with a planet which is causing the microlensing. So if the object which is causing the microlensing is a star and a planet system, the distant star's light gets bent by both the star and the exoplanet. And this can be measured when you observe the light over time. So coming to method 5, this is the last method. So we are already seen that a planet can cause its star to seemingly wobble a little because of the gravitation between them. Now this wobble can also be observed as a slight shift in the star's position in the night sky relative to its neighboring stars. So in the previous method, what we observed was the wavelength shift. Now we are seeing the actual star shifting slightly in position relative to all the neighboring stars. So this change in position of a star indicates that there is some other object near that star which is acting gravitationally on it. And that is one way to find an exoplanet as well. So this plot shows you the methods which was used to discover the 4,284 confirmed exoplanets that we saw previously. So you can see that the most widely used method is the transit method, followed by the radial velocity, and then the microimaging, and imaging is the least used method. So in the case of imaging, you need huge telescopes. So that was all the methods that are used to find exoplanets generally. Now we are talking about finding exoplanets from your backyard, right? So which one of these methods do you think is going to be useful for finding those exoplanets from your backyard of the 5 listed methods?